I studied the Great Depression. Because I did that, I was able to anticipate the 2008 financial crisis. We made a lot of money in the financial crisis because I understood what happened in the Great Depression. So in this case, three big things are happening that never happened before in our lifetimes. And the last time they happened was in the 1930 to 45 period. And those three things are the creation of a lot of printing of money to pay for the debts. We needed to at the time, but it was very overdone. We actually sent out checks which were about 5 times as much as the amount that would have compensated people for their losses. Where'd they get the money from? The government borrowed the money. Who did they borrow the money from? The Federal Reserve. So now everybody gets all these checks and everybody's happy because they get all these checks. But when they get all this money and then they spend it, everybody's surprised they got inflation. We've increased the amount of money by 25% or more. The price of anything is equal to the amount of money and credit spent on it divided by the quantity of it sold. And so when you increase the amount of money and credit, buying power, spending, by a lot more than you increase the quantity, you get inflation. Because what happened in both of those cases is they hit zero interest rates. So I can't lower the price of money. So what do? Number two is the amount of internal conflict that's going on in the United States. The size of the wealth gaps, the size of the political conflicts is the greatest since not only the 30 to 45 period, it's much greater than that, 1900. You have to go back to 1900 to have that conflict. We're having a form of a civil war where populism is one side in a battle with the other side that won't accept losing. Well, that's why in the next elections, there's a good chance that neither side will accept the result and accept losing. History shows that when the causes people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. Right now, there's not much agreement and the polarity is becoming greater. The political right now, if you follow politics, if you even watch events like, what will the reaction be to Supreme Court making the decision of Roe versus Wade? Why are moderates in the political system choosing not to run for re-election? We have this internal conflict that is actually threatening rule of law and the adherence to the Constitution. It's entirely possible that people with different views, they will go to different places and they will fight. So that degree has never happened in my lifetime before. 1945 was when the New World Order began. These world orders happen because there's a conflict and then somebody wins. So that brings me to the third thing that's happening, which is the rise of a great power to be comparable, China, and with it, Russia, and they form alliances, right? There's the Allied powers and the Axis powers, two different sides, kind of. And then they're competing because what happens is when you have a new world order, the winners of the war get to set the rules. So in 1945, America won. And it was the richest country in the world. It had 80% of the world's gold, and gold was money. And it had 50% of the world's economy. And it had a monopoly on military power. It set the rules. And that's why the UN is in New York and the World Bank and the IMF are in Washington, D.C. It set the rules. So that's changing. There are certain things that we're doing. We're spending a lot more than we're earning. We're living off the printing presses. We're letting the infrastructure go. We're giving our next generation debts. We're not educating all children well. If you educate your people and they are more civil with each other and you provide equal opportunity, the system will work better. In this world order battle, and we have a world order battle, there is an allied and axis power kind of thing that is emerging. There's certainly a competition. There are 5 different kinds of wars. There's a trade war. There's a technology war. There is a geopolitical influence war. There's a capital war, and there could be a military war. And those are the patterns of history. And there's only one way to do well, and that is to be strong in all those ways. So I'm very bipartisan. I believe the opposite of the polarity, the extremes of the left or the right. I pray for the middle and bipartisanship to find ways. I've watched the process evolve in the cycle. So what happens is you have the war, you have the new rules. Wars are sort of great equalizers, and then you come back. And then you have a period of peace and prosperity. You have peace because nobody wants to fight the dominant power, and you have more equal people, and then they have prosperity. But the way the system works is over a period of time, that creates differences in wealth. And that's fine. You provide capital, that's the capital system. People with great ideas come along and they're productive and inventive and they produce great things and so on. But as they obtain the greater wealth, they also obtain greater benefits, like they could educate their children better. And if you're poor, you don't get to educate your children better. And so the polarity increases and it becomes unfair because, we all should have like equal opportunities. And then you also build up a lot of debt. Here's the irony of it. As these cycles begin at their later stages, the rich are the ones who get into debt. Now, you would think it's exactly the opposite, right? Because if you're rich, it's easier to have a good living standard and save. But like the United States, when per capita income was 40 times that in China, it started to borrow from China because they have a big saving mentality. When you have a poor person who doesn't have much, they want to save. Their saving is in our currency because when they think, how do I save in world currency? I'm going to buy dollar denominated debt and I'm going to save in it when we borrow. And that's been the case. We didn't experience what our prior generations experienced. And that creates a cycle.
I think that we're not going to be able to bring an interest rate to a high enough level to give a good real return to holders of credit without causing a contraction in economic activity. The way it really works is you take money and credit away from people, right? And something else costs them, so they spend less. And because they spend less, then you have less inflation. Yeah. All of them have been painful, and we produced a whole lot of debt. And so now even the Federal Reserve is going to start selling 1.1 trillion. And then you have the Treasury selling $1 trillion. And so there's a lot of selling. And what that does is it takes private credit.
Can we get a soft landing doing what we're doing right now? Markets kind of hope against all odds that we can and we avoid a recession. What do you think?
Well, you had an 8% inflation rate. Look at what people get. And we're talking now about a 3% interest rate. And people think that that's good. Right. So you're going to lose buying power. I think the inflation will come down a bit, but it's going to be very high. And money's going to get a lot tighter. So you're going to have a stagflation, similar to the 70s, but none of them are all the same. There's always a paradigm shift. The way a paradigm shift is, it's like there's a 10-year period. And almost every 10-year period is the opposite of the 10 years before. The 70s produced the 80s. At the end of a period of time, everybody believes that the future will be like the last 10 years. Right. And everybody's positioned that way. So when you look at the environment that we had over the last 10 years, not inflation, low interest rates, availability of credit. So these moves take place typically over a period of 10 years, and there, let's say, two legs to the move. So you have a change in mindset. People thinking what is safe. Used to think that cash was safe, a safe investment. But cash it loses buying power to inflation. So now as people realize that loses buying power, and as the Fed has to deal with the tightening of monetary policy, you get the first leg. And that's the first leg that we're in. And so that's the nature. We're no longer the dominant power. So it becomes closer. So now when we deal with existential issues for different parties, there is a risk of these things. If China became Russia, think about the economic consequences of how we're intertwined. 22% of American manufactured goods imports come from China. So Just imagine China became like Russia. In other words, you say, I don't want to take imports. So people don't buy their Nike, they don't buy their Apples, they don't buy things that are produced in China and so on. Do you know what that would mean economically for us in terms of the inflation rate and the consequences because of how they're intertwined?
Well, the argument would be it hurts China more, we say.
Who cares if it hurts China more?
Yeah.
Right? Is that a win when it hurts you terribly? Okay, so when you have a war, both sides lose. I'm just trying to be practical here. If we're looking at this, you asked the question, where are we? We are at a risky position, right? We understand this. What would the consequences be? I'm describing the consequences mechanistically. The way it works is there's a new order. And a new order comes out of a conflict, and so one side wins. So the last world order began in 1945. Then there's the dominant power, economically and so on. And then as they become the dominant power, you have a period of peace and prosperity because nobody wants to fight it. People work together. It's a great equalizer also. Wealth gaps are left. People come back and they're produced, that generation. Then what happens over a period of time is things get better. You change the generations, you change the approaches, and then you build up larger wealth gaps, wealth is something in our system that is not distributed equally, or you build up resentments or values gaps.
Are we at that pressure
point?
And
we certainly are. That's not a controversial statement.
Right.